Hey, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on, mate.
Hey Andy, thanks for having me.
The irony is, I'm from Bristol and in America, and you're not from Bristol, I don't think, but in Bristol as we speak virtually. So,
Correct, a shared kind of Bristol journey, but in two very different times.
yeah, a very well. Also, we've spoken about this, but you're at Bristol Bears. I was formerly an intern at Bristol Rugby, and we've had very different. We've been at the club at very different levels of success. I think for the team as
Yeah, I
well.
think you would have been at Clifton Rugby Club, wouldn't you?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
years gone by now, we're in the new swanky facility here in Fayland. So I did experience Clifton. I did have the a little bit of time in the national grounds with the muddy, boggy pitches, but it's a far cry from where we are now.
I'm pretty confident. I'm pretty confident your timing is better than mine, at least. So, what we normally do is just kick off with people's background. Do you mind just kind of walking us through, I guess, your career origins and just bring us through to the current day and what your role is as well?
Yeah, for sure. So I started out in kind of sports science S&C back at uni. So I went to St Mary's University in Twickenham and I did my undergrad in strength and conditioning science because I wanted to go down that avenue of S&C and athletic performance. And it was towards the back end of my time there, probably in the third year, where I'd done a couple of little short stints of internships or shadowing or placements. I got really interested in the kind of medical rehab side of S&C and thought that maybe working within the RTP space was going to be where I want to work. So I finished up my S&C undergrad and started doing an internship, a strength and conditioning internship at Surrey Sports Park with James Wild. And I did that for 2 years alongside doing a master's in sport rehabilitation again at St Mary. So I just stayed there for 5 years straight. And that gave me this really cool, all encompassing educational background from strength and conditioning, working through non-injured athletes and working through various types of populations in sports, and then having this theoretical medical background with the sport rehab masters, as well as doing a couple of placements. I did some championship rugby placements. I actually went out to America. I did 2 weeks in San Francisco at a tennis facility, which was really cool. That was a very different environment to what we were doing over in England. I was very lucky that I had a friend out there, so I could go and stay out there, and I didn't have to fork out cash to stay in San Francisco. But it was the people got you out there. And then as I was finishing up my 2 years of internship alongside the masters, I ended up falling into a conversation with Tom Batchelor, who was at Harlequins at the time and is now working with GB Hockey. But Tom was the first team sports scientist at Harlequins, who conveniently also trained at Surrey Sports Park where I was doing my internship. And Tom had also done that internship about 2 or 3 years ago. So a role came up with Quins to go into a sports science role. And at that point, I was working with Surrey Scorchers, who were the basketball team at the sports park, and I was really keen on the load monitoring side and training load, and how do we make sure that the players are prepared for the games and how are they recovering from games. And this is all part of my. I took a lot on, like a lot of the S&C stuff, a lot of the rehab stuff, and then I decided that why don't I start taking on the sports science stuff, and kind of ended up going into a role there with Quins as the assistant sports scientist, which was a lot of day-to-day work of data collection, data reporting, data management, and spent 2 years there. I learned a lot. Because I went in there with no experience really of data. I wasn't a data guy beforehand. I wasn't a computer guy beforehand, so I was very much starting from scratch. I had never even held a GPS unit before I went into that role, so it was a bit of a baptism of fire, but really enjoyed it. And from there I spent 2 years and actually finished up at Quins in the summer of 2019. Went travelling for a little bit because there was no jobs around, and then it was around December of 2019 that I applied for this job. Didn't think anything of it because I said on the application I'm not going to be back in the UK until kind of earliest of February. But fortunately enough, my CV made it into the maybe pile and then into the yes pile, and so I've been at Bristol Bears now since February 2020 as first team sports scientist. So this is coming up to 6 years at the club, and it'll be 6.5 seasons.
How much have you noticed the sort of sports science role has changed in rugby? And then the reason I ask that is when I was an intern at Bristol years ago in the S&C department, there was no official sports scientist. It was very much there was physios and there was S&C coaches. I think Petsy, one of the S&C coaches, was even kind of sort of moonlighting as a nutrition guy as well at the time as being the assistant strength coach. Versus now, obviously, there's much more there's more granular roles within a sports team. How have you noticed, particular in rugby, that role has changed?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's probably not evolving as fast as some other sports, and I think that's probably just down to the fact that we aren't a cash-rich sport like football is, or like a lot of American sports are, where you can afford to have a lot of bodies in the offices. But then that just puts a little bit more emphasis on the people that are in the seats to develop themselves. I've certainly developed myself a lot from being the first. My first iteration of being a sports scientist was literally just data dumping into Excel and reporting. And I think what a lot of people are getting way better at now is actually making use of the information and creating insights from the information. And I think this is probably across a lot of sports as well. I think if you were to chat to any guys that were in Premier League football in the early noughties, or maybe in the late noughties, early kind of tens, when load monitoring and GPS tracking and visual motion tracking started to become a real thing, it's probably miles away. They probably operate miles differently from what they did back then. So I think the influx of technology and the influx of information has forced people to either kind of sink or swim, really, either adapt and grow with it, or maybe take a step away because it's too much. And that's not a bad thing either, because you don't want to be, information overload could be a killer if you're not happy with that information and where it's going. So I think the way that it's grown with us is certainly technology. Like, we've had loads more technology come in nowadays, and with that, every single piece of technology has got hundreds and hundreds of metrics or values that seems to grow every year. It seems that every time you log on to a cloud platform of one of your pieces of technology, you get a little pop-up that says, we can now track XYZ variable. And so the amount that you have is growing, and then the amount that people are doing with it is growing. And I think a lot of it is becoming I think there's a period where we probably got a bit scared, and we were quite reductionist as a career is probably the wrong way to say it, but as an environment of sports science within elite sport, there was certainly a point of time where everyone was kind of looking at sports science to be the tool that can reduce load and reduce burden and watch for injuries, because we can, he's in the red or he's undertrained. And that, I certainly fell victim of that myself. Like, I've stood pitch side and think, I think we need to do less because of X, Y, Z. And I think I've probably gone kind of, maybe not full circle, because maybe I was never here in the first place, but I use sports science as a performance tool. I don't like to sit there and say, we need to limit person A, B, C because of this. I'd rather have a situation where we can use sports science to develop young players or push intermediate players and retain and hold on to the skills and performance capabilities of those aging players. Yeah. So I think it's probably gone back on itself, and then it's developing again.
Yeah, I think it kind of went through a phase of, I hope you don't mind me saying, I think it went through a phase of like sports science almost becoming like forex trading, where people are sort of looking at a graph and trying to time the intervention based on just what they see in front of them on the iPad. And I think it got pushed into that direction, and I think it's fair to say it's coming back out of that now, and it's become the science again of like, okay, what's the questions that we want to answer? What are the sort of adaptations that we want to unlock, and how do we best do that? I think it's kind of going back to a kind of true science role rather than a data role, really.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people probably looked for like the quick answer or the quick easy fix that's going to be this one kind of all-encompassing answer to sports science, like something like a ratio, like the acute-chronic ratio, which has this nice fundamental thought process, and obviously it has its flaws as well, which has been accepted, but you would have seen a lot of people around that time use that as their bedrock of athlete management or athlete monitoring. And I work in a sport where injuries are not just running based or training based. I could have someone in a perfect sweet spot of running and they break their arm, and there's nothing to say that I can protect every sort of injury. So I'm certainly more going towards the performance side of how can we drive the program, how can we drive the players, how can we make sure that when we play the style of rugby that the head coach wants, how can we play it to its best and really make sure that teams can't cope with it.
I think we always go into these, like, I'm sure we'll do it again, I think we always go into these binary good-bad situations where I remember years ago we would do like FMS or things like that. With pre-season movement screen, good, bad. Later on that becomes, I don't know, like force plate jumping, like, oh, they have to be able to do this, or a Nordic score, they have to be able to hit this number. And then I think like we use those tools for longer, we find the nuance, we find the broader context, we realise it's not as black and white as we think. I'm sure we'll do it again, there'll be some new technology that comes out and we'll all jump on it, we'll get very excited and we'll go, they need to be able to hit this standard or else. And then we'll go, it's a bit more complicated than that. I think it always happens, but I'm really curious. You put out a post recently on LinkedIn with some slides on how do we get data into being action, or how do we drive action from data in the return to play process. What was the sort of basis of that work, or what triggered that piece of work for you?
Yeah, so I think it's probably something that's just lingered in my mind for a long time, because when you work with data, everyone just assumes that data is the answer, and data is just a collection of numbers and values. And I think the way I build it on LinkedIn is there's kind of like a 4-step process, and there might be a 5th, 6th, 7th step if someone smarter than me wants to add on to it. But I look at data as the initial number or data point that we're looking at. So if you take something like a GPS output, for example, your data is all of your different distances covered in velocity bands, or efforts covered in velocity bands, and then the information is those velocity bands surmised into one metric. So it could be velocity band 5, 6, 7, 8 creates high speed running, and that's your information standpoint. And I think a lot of information is just a snapshot, it's a moment in time, or it's a moment in that athlete's training day, training week, training stage. And it offers us exactly that, a snapshot. Where is he at? Or, like you say there with the jump height, the output is just the information. It doesn't mean that they should or should not train, or they should or should not develop. So I recently went to the Catapult conference, I think it's called Turn Information to Insight, or something along those lines. And Aman Shergill Singh from Aston Villa did an excellent presentation on how he turns information into action, and it just got me thinking about, I do all this stuff but I haven't put it down on paper. And so the best thing he put out was, data without context is just noise, context without data is opinion, but data plus context, or data with context, is information and insight. And I thought that was great, because I probably, without me realising, I am doing that. I'm providing data, but I'm also providing context. So I am giving this insight to the staff members here and the coaches here and the players. And the reason I kind of put that LinkedIn post together selfishly was just for me to put that into kind of a 10-pager, so I could understand what I was really trying to get through, but then also share that, because it's always cool to get other people's ideas around it. And I think insight is where we lose the most amount of insight in any given process, because I think it takes experience and a bit of confidence and a lot of knowledge to actually have that insight. I think we get stuck at information, like I say, and I think we jump from information to action a little bit too much, because without that insight of what you are working with, your action could either be a bit naive, it could be a bit reductionist, it could be way too progressive. So that was the bulk of why I put it together, so I could put a few of my ideas onto paper, almost as such, and then see what other people think of it. But I just wanted to show where it is that the sports science role can actually help every role. It doesn't just have to be like the rehab and the RTP like we're mostly going to discuss today, but that could be performance analysis, that could be recruitment, that could be ticketing and commercial in the operations team. It's just a nice 4-step process that I've worked away with.
Obviously it really depends on the kind of objective data point that is in question, but what are some kind of qualitative contextual examples that you might try and understand or marry with the kind of just raw data that you see? Yeah,
for sure. So if I think of let's say a rehab example, we could talk about a back three player in rugby. So obviously, you know the positions in rugby, but your back three players are your wingers or your fullback. They're typically your faster guys in the pitch. They will be the guys that score most of your tries because the ball's going to get to the edge to them. They also tend to be almost your last line of defence if phase play is occurring. So for them to be able to attain high velocities is key to their position. It's not the be all and end all, because I've worked with some slow wingers that are still very good, but they also have to do quite repeated bouts of high speed, and they have to do it often, they have to do it unanticipated, they have to do it in response to stimulus, they have to do it planned. So if we had a rehab situation where you have back three player, let's say max speed, for the ease of numbers, let's say max speed is 9 meters per second. In any given training session, they're going to have 500 to 600 meters of high speed running. Let's say that's above 5.5 meters per second. And that's going to be across 40 to 50 efforts. That's information. The data comes before that, the collection, like I spoke about, the velocity bands. The insight to that is, how did that occur? So is this player training as a starting winger? I.e., are they going to be doing a lot of anticipated running? Is it going to be a lot of kick chase because we're on the front foot? Is it going to be a lot of coming onto the edge because they are coming from the blind side to the open side? Is it going to be a lot of our backfield coverage because we're working on our counter-attack of that week? Or the defensive side of it? And is a lot of that actually cover tackling, unanticipated? Is it some work where they're working in a pendulum because they're now receiving our exits? And that can create a difference in output, because there's a little bit of a tangent here. If I said to you, you and I are going to go out on a run, and this is the best way I've had this described to me. We're going to go out on a run and we're going to run 5 kilometers together. But you're going to run it at a pace that is completely dictated by me. And we're going to go off together and we're just going to go a nice steady jog. And then without notice, I'm just going to break out into a sprint. And then I'm going to slow down and then I might change direction and go somewhere else. By the end of the run, we've probably both done the same thing, but I'm probably going to have had the easier run because I know what I'm going to be doing. Physiologically, biomechanically, we're probably going to be similar, but you're going to perceive that's quite hard because you have the added cognitive stimulus. And this comes down to, this is like a differential RPE kind of thing. We might have the same physical output, but cognitively you might have a different, and that may then lead into different physiological demands as well. But the insight of where the player and how the player is achieving that can then have the action for this rehab plan, this rehab run. And even within rugby union, I'm sure this is the same with football, probably the same with American sports, Australian sports, the wings aren't the same roles. We could have, our right winger has a higher kick chase demand because we kick to the right, our left winger could have a higher counter attack because we prefer to have him in the backfield, and so forth. So that insight piece of how the information is then used would be, right, rehab data is the chunk data, the information is the clustered data. The insight is, he's done this rehab run, but he's done 500 meters across 18 efforts. My insight to you is, when he returns into rugby, he's going to be doing far greater efforts, even though the volume is the same. So it's going to be very, very different exposure for him as he gets back into the rugby. So should our action now be, we're chasing the same amount of volume, that's fine, because we want him to be prepared for the demands of the training week, the training day, and so on. But we're going to have to get it a very different way, because he's not going to be used to the amount of entries into those high-speed zones, which obviously come accompanied with a high acceleration or a high deceleration. Obviously in rugby union we have contact and collision involvements, so that could be something slightly different. But the density of that running is going to be very different. So my suggestion is, if we send this, with this information provided, if we send this player into training next week, I don't think he's going to be prepared to meet the training demands. And nothing might happen. He might just find it more taxing. We might have a higher heart rate response out of him. We might have a higher perceived exertion out of him. Touch wood, he doesn't get injured. But could we use this insight to prepare him better to go into training? Around the house is a little bit of how I describe that. But
do you think in the past we've maybe been too simple and had too fewer objectives around this in rehab? And what I mean by that is maybe just being too simplistic and saying, okay, athlete needs to be able to hit X speed, objective done, or they need to be able to hit this distance or volume, rather than it being they need to be able to hit this volume of this intensity of this stylistic execution that matches the sport. So having not just like a few simple objectives that are pass-fail, but actually those are precursors to more sport-specific running-related objectives. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. Like having pass-fail markers, you have to have them, but I don't think you should hang your hat on them, and I don't think many people do. Certainly here we don't. We we may fall victim to it for a few things, like we may chase an objective marker and then be happy with it, but I would always ask why. And well, firstly, why is it a marker? Is it just a injury thing, or is it a best research thing, or is it something that we have put as the pinnacle of them clearing this rehab? Can we return them to a Nordic peak force that was greater than pre-injury, and so forth? But I think you have to contextualize these pass-fail markers or this objectivity, because you're completely right. If we just sat down with a soft tissue injury and said, once we see them achieve 90% velocity and once they have covered a match load of high-speed running, they can return to training, like, they're going to break down again.
Yeah.
Especially with stuff like the max velocity, we're working with GPS units that track they track the velocity 10 times, 15 times a second, and even there's error rates. There's always error rates, and the sampling rate may drop. You may be doing it in. We're fortunate where we are. Our training ground is it's pretty open, so we get good satellite lock on all the time. But there's certainly going to be some teams that train within a stadium environment, and the roof overhang could interrupt the GPS signal. So, can you be completely confident that 9.25 meters per second is accurate? And if it is, great. How many times has he done it? How long did he hold it for? Are we literally just touching the flame of 90%? Or are we exposing these guys to a high bout of it to know that their soft tissue can tolerate it? Especially for your fast guys. Like, I'd be kind of squeaky bum time if they're only going at 90.5% on a GPS report, because, is that 1 meter? Is that 1 second? Is that 10 meters?
I guess the thing is, like, I think people are tempted to not build out these really expansive rehab criterias that have tons and tons of rungs on the ladder, because it almost and it's not, but you think, it's going to make rehab go longer. But actually, I think it's just the more rungs you can put on the ladder, as in, like, the more objectives that you're expecting them to hit, it doesn't actually influence the timeline of the finish for the rehab. I think it just changes the confidence level that you have nearer the end. If in your, like, later stage, if we call it that, part of rehab, there's 10 things you're looking for rather than 3, you're probably more confident when the player returns to play, rather than if you've got fewer, more simplistic, reductionist markers of return to play, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Like, you want to cover all bases, but you don't want information overkill. Like, I'd never go into the room, the medical room, and be like, well, today he's got to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. Like, you're just going to lose them at A, B, C, to be honest. And unfortunately, with a sport like, we're a very locomotive sport, so when you've got one metric that you're trying to chase, that probably does marry up with 2 or 3 others. So inherently, that they do come together. If you're chasing a high max velocity stimulus, well, you're also going to get very, very high speed running stimulus as well, if it's done how you want it to be done. And similar in the gym, if you chase an increase in lower body strength through your primary lift, chances are you're probably going to chase lower body strength in your accessory lift as well. Like, these things aren't 0.99 correlated, but they're pretty close in this environment. So I think you want to find this sweet spot of being reductionist and missing things, and being so overwhelmed by data that you end up missing things as well. You can't see the wood from the trees.
I agree. I kind of pulled you away on a bit of a tangent there, but one of the things you kind of mentioned earlier was sort of like the difference between collecting information and actually, like, true insight. How do we get stuck in the sort of information stage in this sort of process?
Yeah, I think probably it's a little bit of a crutch, where you could use a number, as we mentioned there, as like a pass-fail, and you chase it, and you get really kind of like excited by chasing it. It's almost like you've got a savings account, and you know that you want to get to £1,000, and when you get to £1,000, you're happy. And anything after that is a positive. But if I want to buy a car that's £10,000, then that £1,000 is only it's a small marker of it, isn't it? So I think there's probably a little bit of, I don't want to say fear, because fear would suggest that we're scared of doing a bit more or investigating the kind of back end of the information, but there's probably a little bit of acceptance that the information can provide us something, but then a little bit of fear that if we try to search for some insight, we might find that information is useless.
Yeah.
Or not necessarily useless, but rendered a little bit less useful than what we first imagined it to be. And if that is something like a particular strength marker in the gym during a rehab process that we eventually hit. But what if we haven't managed to achieve our other goals at the same time frame that we wanted? What if they're still unable to fully cut in a change of direction despite having been able to increase their single leg loading on a knee injury? I'm just plucking things out here. I'm not the medical guy as much as you are, but if we would probably be a bit fearful of what we can uncover with searching, with digging a bit deeper.
Do you think we've fallen prey to this kind of good arts law principle of, when a measure becomes the target, it can cease to be a good measure, in that like we've all sort of seen the example with like a counter movement jump where the athlete gains the measure by lifting their knees up and getting a longer flight time. Do you think we've almost gone through that as rehab professionals, where we've kind of hung our hat on these measures maybe a little bit too much at times?
Yeah, perhaps, but then I also don't think that's always the bad thing, because if you do dig deeper and get overwhelmed by other metrics, like you go onto a force plate software now and you've got, I like the fact that you can just look at your jump height or your impulse, but then you think, I want to have a little bit of a dive into what's happening in the eccentric phase, and all of a sudden you just type in eccentric and you've got eccentric duration, eccentric braking force, eccentric braking impulse, eccentric deceleration, and all of these metrics that, unless you are a proper force plate guru or a bit of a biomechanics expert, you could get lost in that. And sometimes I'd actually rather us hang our hat on the earlier metric. Like say if it's jump height, fine. That's probably where you need to be somewhere in between, where you've got the test and you've got the kind of outcome marker. And in that middle muddy part, that's probably where you need to lean on someone like myself that has a bit of Robin Thorpe spoke about this, like the general specialists or the special generalists, who can help identify, well, the test is good, but the marker you're looking at might not be telling us the true story, so why don't we look at this? And just provide 2 options rather than 17, and then you can probably unlock something new. But yeah, I certainly do think that we can probably get a little bit of stuck by this principle of the marker is there, so let's chase it.
We actually did an episode. You were speaking about metrics there. We actually did half an episode with Daniel Cohen. It got interrupted halfway through and we never finished it. So we've got this kind of like half done episode that we can't release. But Daniel's a great guy, and I remember when I had that conversation with him, I'm sure you won't mind me saying this, but there's hundreds of metrics even for like eccentric alone.
Yeah.
But actually he was saying that there's only a few that you're really probably going to hang your hat on and actually use. You can go way into the weeds and find out all these like unique metrics, but actually from driving an actual meaningful decision, it's still probably going to be anchored on quite common metrics that we always rely on.
Yeah, well, there's that bridge from data to information. Like just on force plates alone, the data points would be incredible. So you may as well like find the information and then move from there.
In terms of sort of like answering the rehab or the scientific questions that you have, or feeling confident to hang your hat on maybe a certain stage of rehab, what does good data look like for you? We've mentioned sort of like it not just being numbers but actually having context. What does good data mean to you? What does that involve?
Yeah, so it's the first part with good data starts before you even have the data, and it's all with testing protocol. Or if it's not a test that you're doing, it's the technology that you're using. Are you using a piece of tech that is valid and reliable? Is it something that is going to be helpful across this journey of the rehab, and is it actually going to be relevant to the injury site or to the person? And then once you've settled on that, let's say we're using some strength diagnostic tests. The good data has to be clean from the moment that the test protocol is put on. So if I'm doing, like I do a lot of like single limb isometric tests we've got like a testing rack in the gym. So we'll be doing some kind of full stand-in, peak plantar flexion, calf isometrics, like the Alex Natera run specific isometrics. We do a lot of the ankle iso pushes, and I'm the only one that really does the test protocol. So I know that every time the data is really clean from the testing protocol, because I'm the same person that does that, I do the same time. I'm quite, believe it or not, quite anal about setting up the protocol of it, because I know that I'm using the data on the other side. if I'm doing a test like that, like let's say one day I just come in and I say, well, pick your pin height. Oh, you got different shoes on. That's fine. Don't worry. It's really spongy, and the plates are a little bit unlevel on the floor. That's fine. Let's just do it. What's the point in doing it? Like I'd rather just not do the test at all on that day. So if there's a point where, or another example, if I'm in like a force frame and I'm doing a shoulder test on one side of internal rotation, but my athlete is grabbing the other side of the force frame to pull himself in and squeeze him. Well, I'm probably not testing the actual the arm that I want to test here. I'm probably just testing some kind of squeeze mechanism that's not telling me the truth. So, like GPS unit, turn it in back to front. That's not good data. Heart rate belt drop far down. That's not good data. So, good data starts before you even collect the data. It has to be really, really, really clean. And then the testing environment is really important. Like I mentioned earlier about the working in a stadium overhang, you could have quite shoddy GPS data from that. I've been in a couple stadiums where I look at the raw data afterwards and the satellite count is down, the accuracy is down, and the signal quality is down, and that's a bit disappointing when you come off the back of a match because you can't be 100% certain on a few things. Fortunately in rugby there's not many stadiums like that. A lot of them are quite old school and kind of cave themselves backwards, but I know a lot of these modern day football stadiums have a big stadium over a big like roof overhang. So that can be an issue. You could have, let's say you're doing a counter movement jump, and actually at the same time that you're doing a counter movement jump in the gym, someone's doing a trap bar lift, and they drop their weight at the same time that someone lands on the plate. Like, it's a probably flash in a pan moment that doesn't happen very often, but that's going to skew your data. So the pre-test checks and the testing environment is all really important to get the good data. And obviously you've got all the kind of other boring sports science things that probably isn't of interest to many people on this podcast, but things like making sure people have the same GPS unit all the time labeled to them, the same device, the same setup, the same et cetera. And then when we talk about further from that, you've got to have a good database, you've got to have good data hygiene, you've got to have data cleaning to go and make the information off of it. I think that's good data. Anything off the back of that, in terms of like what you make an action of, that comes with a little later part, and that comes probably down to things like, are you using any statistical tests, and are you using any kind of real life assessments of how someone has made a change? Are you just looking at a number and saying, that's bigger than that, so it must be better? Or are you doing something like a smallest worthwhile change to see if they have improved statistically significantly? Because you could just sit at a meeting and say, player A previously had Nordic score of 501 newtons, now has 502. Have they actually got better? Or do we need to have a look at their bulk of data, have a look at their standard deviation, work out their smallest worthwhile change, have a look at their coefficient variation and see if it is all sound for us to use? Are we looking at this data from pre-injury? Are we looking at them from 3 years ago? Are we looking at them when they were 10 kilos heavier? And I think that makes it really important to do. I've learned a lot recently. I do quite a bit of it's mentoring or CPD work with Sean McLaren up at Newcastle Falcons, and we speak a lot about how important it is to have normalised data if the data is non-normal, because if you talk about, let's say, the mean of a group, but you've got these massive outliers, the mean of the group probably isn't the mean of the group, and that goes the same for one individual person's bulk of data. Again, using CMJs, for example, you could have, I've got 6 seasons worth now of counter movement jumps for various players, whether they're injured, whether they're flying fit, whether they're at their peak physical capabilities, whether they're not at their peak physical capabilities, and we could have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of jumps for one player. And if it's not normal, then I don't want to give the medical team an average and say you need to work towards this. We don't want to. Firstly, we don't want to work towards average, because that will probably sell us short and sell the athlete short. But we certainly want to make sure that the data that we are chasing, or the numbers that we are chasing, even if it is those kind of pass-fail metrics that we were talking about earlier, at least it's right, and at least it's good, clean information. So good data is a little bit boring, because it's a lot of the stuff that probably a lot of rehab professionals won't well, no, so I'm probably being a bit harsh there. A lot of rehab professionals will understand it, but it might not be their wheelhouse, or it might not be at the forefront of their mind when going through the rehab process. And that doesn't just go for the RTP. That goes for working with fit guys. That goes for working with academy players. Having good data starts before you even have the data.
How do you, if you do, how do you account for athlete intention or intentionality? And the reason I ask that is, whether we're looking at velocities on the field or jump height, we're looking at really like physical outputs from the athlete. Obviously, we across sport look at workloads, neuromuscular readiness, all these different things. But the athlete can throw a test or throw an output or a value just by their intention and their effort. How much do you, if you do, like factor that in, or is it a case that you're looking at deviated scores and then questioning them? How do you sort of not get caught out by that kind of false negative?
Yeah, so I think, as in, like, say someone pre-injury has this like wildly good score that stands a bit away from the rest of them. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, or you're conducting some form of like data related testing on an athlete, whether that's in rehab or performance, and the score just isn't quite where you want it, or you're just assuming that the score is their best. How do you how do you get around that if you do?
Yeah, it's difficult. I think it depends on the player, doesn't it? It depends on the person and how much you might be willing to push them, how much you know that they are willing to be pushed. A lot of that will come down to like the relationships that you have with players, and then a lot of it will come down to your knowledge of the injury and the recovery. And if you've had someone that's had a really, really traumatic surgery or traumatic injury that's required a big surgery, and they're doing something like a Alex Matera hip ISO push, which is a horrible test anyway, and they are vastly different from uninjured to injured, and the scores are just nowhere near. That's when you just use your practitioner hat and be like, he's clearly trying because I can see the grimacing on his face.
Yeah.
But he's had a massive hamstring tendon repair. Like that's kind of this, you can take those ones. You can take them on the chin because that test is not going to be the be all and end all of how they get back on the pitch. There's so many other things like we've spoken about already. When it comes to the rest of things, probably just the soft skills of knowing the person, to be honest. I don't really have any tools that would be, apart from the general data cleaning and normalizing data to, if someone has jumped 55 centimeters on a counter movement jump once and then 42 for the entirety of the rest of their career, I'm probably going to take that 55 as either bad data or an anomaly that we're not going to chase. I'm not going to sit there and be like, you have to hit 55 before you go back out and play. I mean, can you imagine me trying to say that to a head coach when our star winger doesn't return because he hasn't jumped 55 centimetres? I think I'd be falling 55 centimetres off the balcony if that was the case. But we have a lot of really good practitioners here in this building that will work really well as kind of soft skill practitioners when they need to be, and hard skill practitioner, if that's even such a thing, where we know how to push them at the same time. But it's very much an N equals one. Luckily, like, I work with a cohort of players, and you'll know yourself from working with them previously, rugby players are quite unique. We don't have many of them that won't try and push their hardest, because ultimately we have quite a short calendar. Like, we don't have a lot of games in a year. Despite it being a long season, there's only 10 teams in the Premiership, and if you don't progress through the European competition, you've got 22 like really meaningful games in a year. We have some competitions which tend to be with the younger guys, or those that are on the periphery of the squad. But if you're a senior player and you're in an RTP period of anywhere from 4 to 16 weeks, they don't want to make it 17 because they want to be playing rugby. So they're a unique breed that will 99% of the time will push themselves to have that intent and move past it, and if they have the intent and try and push it, but we aren't seeing the data or the information or the output markers that would suggest that they are moving past their injury and recovering, then that's when you have to have the insight and not just rely on the markers and not just rely on the data or information. There might be some other underlying data or might be some other underlying information that we can use, but that's when you have to sit down with a room of people. And like I say, I'm lucky to work with some really great medics here and some really great S&C coaches that we can build a picture as to why player X isn't achieving this score that we've set out for them, and how do we move past it, and how do we have confidence in ourselves and give them confidence that they're going to be ready to return into the rugby.
Is there times where you're comfortable being flexible on the protocol of collection, and times when you're not? I'll give you an example. Like, if an athlete's going through rehab with me for whatever the injury is, and I'm looking at peak force on a particular test, let's say, and I see that, you know, the second rep is better than the first rep, third rep is better than the second rep, I don't want to necessarily follow a protocol that says do 3 reps, because I'm seeing that their scores are climbing. So I might want to go, I might continue to 4, 5, maybe even 6 until I get a peak that's established and then a full. Is there different examples maybe for you in rehab where you're sticking to the protocol versus like, I'm going to be flexible because by being flexible I'm going to get more data that I need?
Yeah, I think we're pretty flexible as a whole multidisciplinary department here for most things. Obviously, it depends what the cost benefit is, right? If you're doing something like an isometric where there isn't really much demand that's going to carry over, like it's hard when you're doing it, but it's not like we're asking you to do a 3RM RDL and then go again and go again and go again. I tend to, when I'm doing those testing protocols, I'll say to the guys, we're going to have 2 build-up sets and have 2 working sets. But if you feel by the end of your final working set that you've still got another 10 out of 10 rep, or you didn't quite reach the 10 out of 10 and you want to go full beans again, then let's go. So I'm not going to sit there and have them do it 10, 11 times, because the chances are they've actually got something to do afterwards, so I don't want to backlog their day. But if we were doing something like max velocity, or maybe once we've done 2 to 3 reps and we've seen 91% of their top speed, 92% and 93%, are we going to get much more benefit from asking them to try and achieve 94 in that given moment and expose them to 50, 55, 60 more high-speed outputs, high-speed distances, another high-speed effort that might be a contraindication to the later session, later in that day or later in that week? That's when we'll probably be a little bit more rigid. Similar to things like, let's say an upper limb injury is returning to do some contact drills, and we go kind of like bone on pad and they feel really comfy and they say, can we go bone on bone? So maybe not, let's respect the healer time a little bit more. But certainly with things that there's not low cost but lesser cost, if they're in the gym and they're repping a weight that we've planned because it was logical and it flies up, let's go a bit heavier. Like, let's be a bit flexible there.
We're speaking a lot about data, and naturally, when people think about data, they think about dashboards, rightly or wrongly. And we like to make things shiny. How do you approach your dashboards? I'm just curious, because everyone wants different information displayed in a different way, different levels of detail, different types of graph. How do you approach the sort of like communication and visualization of this data?
Yeah, it's a bit much nowadays. Like, death by dashboards is quite a common thing that I see on like LinkedIn and your Twitters and stuff. And it's great that people are visualizing data, because I think it's really important to visualize it, because there's not many people like myself that like to just sit and look at numbers. That can be a bit overwhelming for people, and I understand that. And so people like graphs, people like charts, people like to see things on a screen which can give them a snapshot overview or a deeper overview of what it is that they're looking at. My kind of viewpoint of dashboards is, does it provide us with something valuable, i.e. trend over time, or does it provide us with historical data and predictive data, or is it just there because it's numbers on a spreadsheet, and could I just look at the spreadsheet for that instead? Because ultimately, like, we don't want to have 17 different charts on something that are telling us the same thing or a similar thing, or things that don't even need to be said. I've been victim of it myself. Like, I remember the first couple of charts I was making, I would have, dashboards that I was making, I would have a table with all of that information, and then I would just put all of that information to charts next to it. Like, why am I doing that? Why don't you just do one or the other thing? And some of those things weren't even that important. So I think you have to go from, with the end user in mind, that's the first thing that you've got to think about. So if this is a medical or rehab professional, they will probably want things that are injury site specific for this person. So if we're working with hamstrings, they might really want to look at like max velocity exposure, deceleration exposure, Nordic strength. Let's say we're making up this hypothetical injury dashboard or RTP dashboard. for a player. They might not be so interested in having like their session RPE for their upper body gym or their conditioning outputs on the Echo bike today. So with that end user, streamline it and make sure that it's just got the information that they are after. But then with that information, can we create a bit more insight, i.e. trend over time of their Nordic scores, or do we see a drop in Nordic score when high-speed running increases on the preceding day? That sort of thing. So I'd actually rather have multiple dashboards with less on than one dashboard with multiple things on.
Yeah.
That's probably where I'm at. So like the death by dashboards is a bit ironic because I've just said that I want more than one or two dashboards. So I think like we do with training, sometimes you need the minimal effective dose because people can just get lost in things. I probably make more dashboards for the coaching staff off the back of training and matches than I do for the RTP and the medical guys. We have a data scientist here, Harry Sharman, who's excellent at creating dashboards. Sometimes I just say to him, like, "Oh, could you make me like this?" And within an hour, he's got the meat on the bones of it. So he's kind of our go-to guy from that, and then I can kind of just sit back and have a cup of tea while he makes it. But my feedback and my kind of ongoing process with him will be, do we need that? Like, what's it telling us? If it's telling us no more than what the other things are telling us, or if we don't really need it, then why are we putting it up there? I think it's really important for the information that goes on there to be valuable. Otherwise, you've lost someone. Especially if they haven't asked for the dashboard. If you just think, oh, this will be something good to put out there, and it turns out to be just a bit of a waste of time, then you've wasted everyone's time, and you might have lost that person's interest when you try and show them something else again. So you have to know that end user, because if they're not a data orientated or a table or chart orientated person, you've got to be quite smart about what you give to them.
Yeah, I feel like we go through trends as well. Like, I feel like we're at the peak of spider plots or whatever they're called at the moment. Is for everything, and I think there's times where that works, and there's times where I look at it and I'm not sure if this actually provides me any more value than a bar graph or simple line charts and stuff. So
yeah, for sure. And there's so much kind of much like RTP is quite a buzz topic at the minute, and people are really focusing on that rehab space.
Yeah.
Data visualization is as well, just in a slightly different realm. Like, rather than having physiotherapists and rehab therapists getting their eyes in, you get data geeks like me getting my eyes in. So it'll come, like we spoke earlier, it'll come full circle, and people will be back on just tables in no time. And there'll be fancy tables, there'll be new tables, but it'll be tables instead of charts, and then we'll go back to charts.
Obviously, ultimately, with the net result that we're going for is we want to return the player for match demands and high performance. In terms of like how we objectively understand that during rehab, how close do you think we can get, or confident can we be that we're getting this zoo tiger to look like the jungle tiger in the data?
Well, the data pretty close, the information pretty close, but the insight's probably not that close. I think rugby's very unique, and I call it a two-dimensional sport because it's an invasion game that is constant attack and defence in just two straight lines, unlike football, basketball, hockey, netball, where these teams can operate across the full pitch. We're kind of restricted as to where the ball's happening at the minute, and that's really hard to replicate in a rehab scenario. A lot of our early stage, mid stage, and even late stage rehab is run based. We'll have some skill based stuff in there, of course we will, and position specific, but it's really hard to replicate the demands of rugby union. You can get a GPS report in front of you and see that the numbers match up. 500 metres of high-speed running, 100 metres of very high-speed running, 33 accelerations, 33 decelerations, whatever it may be. But how they've got there is very, very different. And you always have players come off the pitch after their first game, and they're like, you don't realise how hard it is to play a game of rugby when you've been down for so long. And it's been something I've kind of like been trying to work on this season is, why is that? Why do they feel like it's so hard to get back into the rugby? Because we expose them to training, and obviously training is still one step removed from the match, but we have so much time and space and affordance with these players that we should be able to get them a little bit closer to that 80-minute game, or maybe a 20-minute sub cameo, but the heat of professional rugby. And I think one thing that we probably miss out on, and is the density of the training. So how many things are we doing in one given moment of time? I'm not just talking about things of taking a jog. I'm thinking about high intensity actions. A metric that we use is repeat high intensity actions, and that is a sequence of either an acceleration, a deceleration, or a high speed effort, and they can have less than 20 seconds between each one. And we did a PCA here, and it looks like repeat high intensity actions occur a lot in matches. They occur often in training, but they don't really occur much in rehab. And it's not surprising, because rehab as a sterile environment doesn't provide you these opportunities to have high activity actions again and again and again and again. Partly because you need to have, as we spoke earlier, a bit of intensity about it. You need to have that kind of desire to get off the line really hard and then really hit the brakes to decelerate, because the opposition have broken the lines. And then you have to continue that over and over again. And that becomes a bit of an issue with the RTP process, is probably the fact that it is quite a lot of it is pre-planned. Obviously, we have a lot of the unanticipated moments. We have a lot of them. We have a lot of the drills, which is, run up to a cone and then we're going to shout a colour and you're going to turn, you're going to go, and then so forth. But inherently, they probably come with a few pacing strategies, unless you design your drill where it's, I'm not going to tell you when we're finishing, or I'm not going to tell you how many reps we're doing. If you say to someone it's 8 reps, there's going to be a little bit of a pacing strategy within there. And obviously, when you come to the game, you can't pace. If you pace the game, you're probably going to get hooked, or you're going to let someone down because you'll have a soft shoulder here or there. And that is probably, I think, the biggest pocket which we can attack right now. And other people might not call it density. They might call it something else. They might call it intensity. Just buzzwords that I like to use around here, and kind of have my metrics that matter sheet next to me at my desk, and that's how we kind of impose it to the medical staff and the RTP staff and the SNC staff here. Is the density of training is the biggest gap between early mid-stage rehab and then coming back into the rugby. Fortunately, I don't think it's too much of an injury burden of a metric, because it's not particularly like a voluminous mechanical thing that could put us under a bit more duress by the time the end of the match comes. But it's certainly something that could be a performance marker. And I think what I'll work on here now is, how do we artificially create the density of training before we return into it. And that's going to be an ongoing project, really. I might not even ever get to the end of it. I'll probably do another analysis with Harry, our data scientist, and find I've made us worse. So we'll see how we go from there. But yeah, preparing them is very easy from numbers on a GPS report. I think you could probably just put a GPS unit on most people playing five-a-side footy, and it would look like they're ready to play a game with International Rugby Union. But very different when it comes down to the crux of it, because there's a lot of things that you can't prepare for. Contact is obviously a big one as well. We're not going to go full smash into one another a week before they might be reintegrated into a game. I guess the argument is could we, or should we? Should we have this higher level of contact that exposes us to what we're going to be seeing? And even then it's hard, because say, are you really willing to put your body onto a line when it's not a match stimulus? I know these guys are wired a bit differently. I wouldn't be, but if I found myself on the pitch, I'd be trying to get off anyway. So there's a lot of components that are so high demand of the match, that whilst we can cover a really good base, and we do a really good job, the RTP staff here and the medical staff here do a really good job of getting the guys back to coping with the demands of the training week and the match. But a lot of it's from a volume point of view. So I think the next step will be, how can we prepare them for those real horrible pockets of rugby where the ball has stayed in play for 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes, and you're going side to side, and it's the 75th minute of the game.
I think rugby is just even really dramatically different in this context to even like American football, in the sense that half the players on the field in the NFL are playing a really choreographed game. If you're playing attack, it's choreographed really at the end of the day. If it goes to plan, you know where you're moving, where the space is going to be, ideally, it's quite rehearsed. So almost sort of like the simulated drill that you do in rehab is actually going to be quite close potentially to some of what actually happens in open play, because it's not that open.
Yeah.
Compared to say rugby, where it's always chaos. So if you get someone to run in a straight line with an awareness of their body mechanics for rugby, they're thinking about technique in rehab, and they can think about everything they've been taught and cued to do. But put a player running after them and a ball over their head that they're looking over their shoulder for in rugby, they're probably not thinking about their mechanics. So it's even outside of the sort of like quantitative data points, just the execution is really different, I think, in rugby as well.
Yeah, it's that unanticipation of the event. Like I said earlier about if you and I was to go out and run, and I can concentrate on my mechanics because I know exactly what speed we're going to run, but you're constantly waiting, is he going to slow down? Is he going to stop? Are we going faster? And you have all of those other things to contest with.
I'm really curious. I'm aware of time. I know it's later in the day for you compared to me. Obviously, you sound like you wear sort of multiple hats from a sort of S&C, rehab, sports science perspective. What sort of things are you looking at yourself at the moment? What things are sparking your interest, maybe developmentally, or what things are you maybe excited about in the profession at the moment?
Yeah, so like realistically, a lot of my day to day is spent with the sports science hat on, and then I lend a hand to the other guys, probably a little bit closer to the S&C than I am to the medics. I'm trying to move more into like a bigger picture, longer term project thinking, because a lot of the stuff that you do when you're kind of proper in the week to week of sport is quite short term. And quite short-term turnaround, which it has to be. Like that's the nature of the beast. We have a game every 6 to 8 days, so you do kind of work in that acute time pocket. But I'm quite keen to start developing into, if I can free up some time in the week to start working on these medium long-term projects, that's what I'm going to do. And a few of the things is going to be identifying, as just mentioned, density of training for RTP. How can we better prepare those players? Going to have a little look at some progression from academy rugby union into professional rugby union. I think that's something that we are probably a little bit behind football in that. I think football have a wealth of data and a wealth of experience and opportunity with their academies. They obviously have the under 21 league, the under 18 league, the PL2, all sorts of things. We have under 18 and under 17, and that's it. And it's only really recently that those age grades have started to have tracking devices, so we now have some objective data on what does a Bristol Bears under 18 game look like for the course of the season. So when we have those guys come through into our senior team, we can get a picture of what they're capable of doing when they come to us, but also, is this person ready for the demands of a Bristol Bears game now, or are they above it, or what's the difference for a player in the underage grade? And the academy space is not something that I've particularly spent a lot of time in, but we've got really good academy staff here. I feel like I'm blowing everyone's trumpet here, but we do have an excellent staff here at Bristol Bears, and our academy S&C is certainly one of the best. So very keen to get to working with them, and then just dive probably a little bit more into how we can create insight off various things. And the bulk of my role is realistically it is with GPS. I hate being called the GPS guy because that's where a lot of people see me using, but it's a hat that I don't mind wearing because it's something that I do enjoy working with. I always read a lot of I go back and read like the same kind of 3 or 4 papers at least once a year, and they're always by the same kind of training load, and kind of not just training load, but training load, training demand authors. So I read a lot of stuff from Martin Bashite, Sean McLaren, Franco, Jace Delaney, and just try to upskill myself a little bit around those guys. I'd love to be in a position where I can kind of sit down and maybe write up a PhD or a prof doc or just some papers from what we've done here and put that into the open world. But I'm scared of it getting ripped to shreds, so maybe I'll just keep it to myself so I don't get any bad press off it.
Well, you've let me put the spotlight on you for a podcast, so maybe it's not too bad. Maybe this is a warm-up for that. So, well, mate, thank you very much for your time. It's been great to get you on the show today.
The pleasure's all mine, mate.